So I just want to tell you something right off the bat. Once I publish this episode, I'm probably gonna lose some friends because they don't know this side of me.
Well, dude, this is the problem, right? I mean, to speak the truth, you start peeling off people who can't get there. But, look, it's entirely possible to talk about these things in ways that open minds. That's the whole point, and if
Mm.
you lose a friend along the way, you might make a couple more, and that's the risk we have to take.
Yeah. As a 23-year-old kid, my animal brain is like really considering the social ramifications of even putting this on the internet.
Hmm.
But it is important, I feel. And just to give a preface, you can give your preface as well, on this sensitive topic. To mention 9/11 in any other light other than the mainstream narrative of terrorists hijacked planes, brought the towers down, you have to go get them, and to imply any sort of conspiracy inside job is treated in the same way. It's as if you're spitting on the graves of people who died on the towers and in the event in general. And I understand the polarized reaction from it. And I just want to preface that I'm no way disparaging those people. I just want to know what really went on because let's say if there was an inside conspiratorial element that the mainstream narrative just obviously is covering up, that would have implications for those very same people. And we're both the 9/11 truthers and the debunkers. They're all coming at the same thing, which is the truth and the love of those who perished transitioned that day. Just a side note, truth, your stance, it should be able to withstand scrutiny. It should be open for discussion, revisitation, all this stuff. If you feel threatened by something, that implies there's weakness there. Because Madhava, if I go up to you and I say 2 + 2 is 5, there's no, you don't feel threatened by that. You're just gonna look at me, okay, tell me more. And you're going to listen to me, entertain me perhaps. But 2 + 2 = 4 speaks for itself. It needs no defense. It should be able to be revisited, scrutinized, and stand, right? So any truth on any topic should stand. Now, basic math is not the same as history, engineering, physics,
Right.
but the same principle stands because this is engineering, physics, and a bit of detective work all in one. And so just that's just to preface everything. No disrespect. This is just what happened. We saw what happened on camera. So let's see if there's any questions. Do you
Hmm.
have anything to add?
Yes, I do. That was well summarized, Kenford. I would also add that we're also dealing with metaphysics here. We're dealing with emotions. And if it were so simple as to just talk about the facts openly, we would be in agreement. But we're not, honestly. For those of you who have not looked into this particular subject, it may be useful to understand that there are thousands of structural engineers and architects that are taking my position um, in terms of demanding a reinvestigation of those events, and for good reason. The other thing to note here, and I'm not sure how informed your audience is about the things like metaphysics and the law of one, or ways of examining ourselves in the world, because what's on the inside is on the outside, so above as is below. And there's a very interesting uh, would it be okay if I went into the rays, if you will, with
Yeah,
that one?
yeah.
Well, as Raw says, I'm a big I study the law of one all the time, almost daily, and I've spent a lot of time in this. But as Ra would say, all the rays or the chakras are important, and it's about balancing them. Yet there is a certain hierarchy, a natural progression through activation of these centers, starting from the ray all the way up to the seventh chakra, the violet ray. And Ra says in the beginning of the Law of One that, any mind, body, spirit complex can jump. You never know. But there's a general progression. And what's interesting here is that the blue ray, the fifth chakra in Indian philosophy in science. This is called the Vishuddhi chakra, sits above the fourth chakra, the Anahata chakra, the chakra of love. And there's a reason for this, because I see in my investigation into history and in this particular subject, and this is why it's relevant, is those who have perfected wisdom can manipulate those who are at the fourth chakra that want to do the right thing out of love for my fellow human being. I want to do the right thing. And that energy can be misdirected by someone who has mastered the next level, if you will. I'm not saying there's a hierarchy, but there is a kind of a hierarchy. And so that's sort of what I'd like to introduce here, is that yes, we're all good people. I mean, most of us, at least I would imagine most of the people here are not psychopaths, but in general, we all want to do the right thing for ourselves, for our families, for our friends, for our community, for our country, and for the world, and for our species. And it is very easy for someone who has mastered perhaps a different level or a higher level of understanding to misguide us. So all of these things come into play when we're talking about a topic like 9/11. To be perfectly honest with you, there's only so far you and I are going to get here, because a lot of it has to be done with due diligence in bringing up content, looking at actual references and citations. And it's very easy to become distracted by the idea that, oh, these two guys are just making things up. You have to go and do the homework yourself. You've got to look. And I have done many podcasts on this subject, and each time we always are able to bring up things and say, look, this is where it's coming from. I'm not just making this up. So that is the first thing. And then the other thing I would like to introduce to your audience, as you're approaching a subject that's highly contentious and provocative, is that you have to first take a step back. And just as you would stretch your hamstrings before going on a long run, you have to do some mental stretching here. And the stretching, I would suggest, is about embracing uncertainty in your own position. Are you approaching this with some preconceived notions of what is? And this is much harder to do. It's not as easy as laying on the ground and touching your toes in a hurdler stretch. How does one loosen up mentally? And the first thing I would like to say in approaching this is, how do you embrace uncertainty? The first thing I would ask your audience to do is to ask yourself, if you have a preconceived notion of what happened on 9/11, ask yourself how certain you are. And if you're extremely certain, ask yourself what it would take for you to change your mind. What would you need to see? And as opposed to personal experiences, for example, nobody is going to convince you that you're not in pain if you're in pain. We're talking about concepts here. We're talking about, as you said, abstractions and stories. And you don't necessarily have a personal experience that is irrefutable. You're basically believing something. So what would it take? And most people I speak to, whether they're structural engineers, architects, or homemakers, most people would say, well, if our government told us it was an inside job, or the New York Times reported it as an inside job, I would change my mind. Right? I mean, how many people would say, no, I still believe it was this, even though every single legacy media source is telling you the opposite? You're going to go with the majority. I'm speaking to most people here. So this introduces the idea of a third person who you're outsourcing to make sense. So all of these things, I believe, are very important as you're approaching this particular subject. So, Kenford, do you want to go right into 9/11, or did you want to talk about other things first? Because this is pretty heady.
I'd have to invite you on another time.
Huh?
There's a lot of things to cover. I do want to comment on what you said initially, that we're all good people. And on my personal experience, because before I read that chapter in your book, just show the camera, just right there. That's his book. There's a chapter on 9/11 in there, and I can speak from a perspective of uninformed and the impressions one receives to come to the consensus conclusion. So as a kid, I grew up, I heard of 9/11, and this is for most people. I heard it based off of what media was saying. It was reinforced of how other people were reinforcing it. So media and the people themselves were all saying the same thing. Plus, this is the kicker, there was a connotation attributed to those who doubted and implied conspiratorial elements. They put them in this outside box of these guys are absolutely crazy, gullible, and don't listen to them. That's the soup that one comes to, generally speaking, and to come to the conclusion, yeah, this 9/11 thing, the terrorists did it. And when looks into it, all you have are the mainstream media reports, the NIST report. I bet not many people actually read the NIST report, like you mentioned. The point is, this is all secondhand information that we trust on outside sources, like you say. So this is what comprises most of people's positions, but there's a contrasting amount of certainty in it. And I think it's fueled by metaphysical things, such as when I see people talk about the truthers and conspiracy theorists, there's a lot of anger usually. Like, how could you, you know?
Yeah.
And that's out of love and respect for those on that day. I don't blame them. It's actually very righteous, and I admire that quality when you look at it in a zoomed out lens. But at the same time, they don't see some things. They haven't dug into it. They haven't read the NIST report itself. They've outsourced that information. And I just want to introduce, like Madhava did, there's more uncertainty here than you might think. And we can tie this into your background as well. So, just to give you some idea of who you are, you're an anesthesiologist with a degree in electrical engineering. So, I'm curious about you. Did you choose electrical engineering as your base to go into medical school? And how did that eventually tie into a 9/11 thing? The everything you've covered in your book, these fringe topics that a lot of people find controversial, but you dived into. Like, how did that journey kind of unfold?
I started as an engineer, and I wanted to do electrical engineering when I matriculated at MIT when I was 17. And I didn't know what kind of engineering I wanted to do. And I was told over and over again that electrical engineering is the most difficult undergraduate major there. And I am kind of a masochist. And so I never wanted to look back at my life and say, oh, I took the easy way out. And that's why, I've ended up here. I'm not saying that's the best advice, but that's the way I grew up.
Mhm.
So I entered that field and I worked in the industry for 6 years. When I first finished my undergraduate education, I had an opportunity to work for a patent law firm. I had an opportunity to work for a Wall Street investment firm as a mathematician, but I decided I was not going to abandon my field of study. And so I worked in the defense industry. That's who was hiring back then in 1988. And it led to some very, very interesting experiences, especially for a young engineer. And we built, the money was coming in from the defense industry. There's a ton of money in that field. And what I found was I was working with incredibly, incredibly intelligent people. I mean, like, I like to use the word three sigmas out. In other words, three standard deviations from normal. And I eventually, towards the end of my 6 year long engineering career, before going to medical school, I went to the Arctic on a scientific expedition where we're looking to see if we could track submarines under the ice cap, because that's where nuclear submarines go when they leave port, because you can't track them with active sonar. So if you're able to do that, if a country could do that, that's a tremendous tactical advantage over any other country. So that was, the premise of what we were doing. And this was being funded by the Office of Naval Research here in the United States. And anyway, to make it more interesting, I was camped out on ice about 100 miles from the North Pole. And that was an incredible experience for a young 25-year-old. And quite frankly, I really didn't deserve to be there. The only reason why I was there was an older scientist, could not meet his medical criteria for being away. And so they needed someone, and they needed a younger guy that could drill holes in the ice and set up cables. And also I built a imaging system that was going to be used in acquiring the data for the data acquisition. So anyway, the point here is, that was all very interesting. And at the end of the experiment, it's too expensive to bring all the equipment back home, all our garbage and everything we used. And so we packed up our computers and our data, and we pretty much scuttled everything else. In other words, we sank it to the bottom of the ocean and we burned everything. And I had this transformative experience looking at this pristine environment and seeing this, billowing black smoke as we burned stuff. And it struck me like, holy cow, what are we doing up here? Like, why are we up here? Like, who are the bad guys really? Are they really that bad? These, Soviet Russian sub people? Why do we have nuclear weapons to begin with? What is happening? And more importantly, why are these super smart people doing this when there could be other things? And so 2 weeks later, after returning to the States, I resigned and started to take classes to go to medical school, hoping that that would, fix things for me in my purpose in life. And so anyway, I went to medical school and became an anesthesiologist. And that was also a very interesting experience. And I have many things to say about the medical field. And a lot of these doubts and uncertainties that are in medicine are not necessarily manifest in how medicine is conducted. We trust our doctors, we trust the CDC, we trust this and we trust that. But there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in medicine. After all, this talk about a system that's even more difficult than tracking submarines. It's like, just how does this physical form work? And we are just taking guesses. We're making pretty good guesses and we're making progress, but we give it a lot more, we give our understanding a lot more confidence than I believe is deserved.
Mm.
But as I was being an anesthesiologist, I was about a decade into my career, I started to ponder something very interesting. It's a very interesting puzzle. I would suggest that one of the greatest contributions to Western medicine, that Western medicine has made to humanity, is actually anesthesia. Most of the medicines we give people, they're Band-Aids. We have antibiotics, which are very good in helping people with infections. It's clearly extended our life, being able to not die from appendicitis or, infections. But most of the advances that we've made in Western medicine are surgical. And you can't do any of these things without anesthesia. What's fascinating here is that when anesthesia was first demonstrated publicly in 1846, right here in my hometown of Massachusetts, Boston, a young man who had a small tumor on his neck was rendered unconscious using a gas called ether, which we don't use anymore, but it's an inhaled agent. And a surgeon removed the tumor, and the guy woke up and had no recollection of what happened and didn't complain of anything painful. And in the audience were a ton of surgeons. And when they saw that feat, they wept openly. They had hardened themselves to the agonizing screams of their patients as they operated without modern anesthesia, and they saw it could be done mercifully. Here we are 176 years later or so, 8, and we still don't know how ether works. Neither do we know how all of the other inhaled agents we use work. And there's a reason for this, because anesthesia, in my mind, challenges a very basic paradigm that the Western medicine doctrine has, which is the physiology of our bodies gives rise to our consciousness. In reality, it's the other way around. Consciousness, I believe, is self-emergent. It has nothing to do with the body. It is non-local. And we have many examples of this in medicine, as a matter of fact, and reasonable medical researchers who have demonstrated that it's not what we think. And so anesthesia actually is a way of unpacking this for the average person to understand. And without going into that, I will say this. So I was happy pondering this question about anesthesia and wondering about, how does this relate to metaphysics and why haven't we figured this out? And then out of nowhere, I'm a father and a husband. I've got a nice job and a nice family and nice home. My wife showed me a 30-second clip on YouTube in October of 2017. And I was like, oh, where was this? It must have been in Las Vegas. It looks like a large building going down, like an old hotel, a casino, whatever. And she said, no, this was 9/11. And I said, what are you talking about? This is not a twin tower. There's a third building that went down at 5:20 p.m. called the Solomon Brothers Building, also known as Building 7. We never heard about it. Why didn't we hear about this building? And when you look at this video, it took my breath away. I encourage everyone to go and try to find, it's all over the internet, just look for Building 7 collapse. And even for the untrained eye, you don't have to be an engineer to see this. Some things pop out at you. The first thing is, we didn't know about it. The second thing is, it was not hit by a plane. The third thing is, it's a very, very large building. This is a 47-story steel-structured skyscraper, which would be the tallest building in most states, but not Manhattan, obviously. And it is coming down fast. It is falling to the ground like a bowling ball being dropped. And it is coming down symmetrically. Why is it coming down symmetrically if there was localized damage? It should come down asymmetrically. So I looked at that and my jaw dropped and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And instead of going to YouTube to find out, what people are saying about it, and then encountering all of these debunkers who, as you said, Canford, denigrate those who challenge what's being said, I went right to NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is a branch of the Department of Commerce. And people just think about the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission sought to explain what was happening geopolitically, but the actual technical description of what happened was tasked with this large body of applied mathematicians, engineers, metallurgists, who literally set the standards for how science is done. And I read that report, and that was astounding because if you go and look at it, you have to first understand that there was no physical evidence. Most of it had been cleaned up, right? So they are making nothing more than a hypothesis because they have nothing to back it up. There were no cameras inside of Building 7. There was no real physical evidence, and they were basing it on observation alone. And so the best that they could do, I'm just going to hit the big points of the problems with the 9/11 explanation, is they built a computer model. That's all they could do. It's like, okay, let's see how the building is designed. And this kind of computer modeling is called a finite element analysis, which means you can model every single column, every single beam in this building, apply parameters like what is the what are the strength of the columns, how are they connected, what is the potential temperature of the fires, where were they located, and come up with a hypothesis, and then apply that hypothesis to the model and see how the model behaves. And now I'm going to say something that is very scientific, but not very technical, which is when you approach a problem like that using a model, you can validate your hypothesis if the model behavior looks like what we observed. It doesn't mean that your hypothesis is right. It means it's not wrong. On the other hand, if the model does not behave like what we observed, that means your hypothesis is wrong. There's no getting around that. This is not, structural engineering. This is what we would call epistemology, which is how do we make sense of what's going on? Shockingly, you can look at the model and how it behaves. It does not look like the building. They proved that their hypothesis, which is one of the columns on on floor 12, column 79, became unhinged, if you will, or separated from the beams it was supporting because things were getting hot. They're calling it thermal expansion. That led to the collapse of the building, but their model demonstrates that that's not what happened. Yet they claim that they proved it. They're lying. You don't have to be an engineer to see this. They are actually misrepresenting what they did. So, there's many things we can talk about here, but this is irrefutable. That's what happened. And to go a little bit further, and I'll let you jump in here in a second, the analysis was reconstructed independently by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, their civil engineering department, and they rebuilt the model on a computer. And the first thing they did was validate it to make sure that they put in NIST's hypothesis correctly, and their model would behave exactly like NIST's did, and it did. So they knew that they're using the correct model in their computer simulation. But they went further. Unlike NIST, who took 7 years to come up with their explanation, which was wrong, this small team said, okay, what do we need to do to make our model look exactly like what we saw? How many columns would have to be compromised? In what sequence? And when they tried to make the model look like the building, they found out something very disturbing, which is all the columns had to fail simultaneously, the internal columns followed by the external columns. There's no way a fire can do that. There's only one way we know how to do that, and that is with controlled demolition. I mean, there might be other ways, but that's what we know. They have proved that that explanation is far more likely than NIST's explanation. So where does that leave us? You know, if we were being objective, we would say, oh, it was blown up. Okay, let's move on. Yet this brings up very, very dark questions. If it was blown up, who did it? And if there were explosives in Building 7, why wouldn't they have been explosives in the Twin Towers? And now we are confronted with some very difficult questions, which is, why would terrorists need explosives and planes? They wouldn't. They would just need one or the other. Why fly suicide missions into the buildings? They could just pull a plunger. And this leads to a very uncomfortable situation, which is terrorists wouldn't need both. Only conspirators would need both. You would need the plane collisions to serve as a decoy to hide the actual mechanism of destruction. And so this is, where we're going. And as I said before, there's only so far you can go here. And I want to say this one more thing. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. This is not the way to make sense of things. I'm not considering myself a structural engineering expert. I happen to be the science advisor to the International Center for 9/11 Justice, but that doesn't make me an expert in how buildings are built and raised. You have to go and do the work yourself. But this is the setup.
Is the video you're talking about for NIST it's like 2 minutes long. They show this one horizontal thing collapsing, then it progressively goes into that. That's what I recall seeing a NIST explanation of Building
Mhm.
7. That 2-minute clip,
It's not even 2 minutes. It's like literally like 8 seconds. And
8 seconds.
before you reference that, you must look at what actually happened
Yep,
first.
of course.
And then you see the building come down like this really fast. And I want to be very clear here, in general, over the course of the collapse, it fell at 95% the rate of gravity, which means if you were standing atop the building at the moment it started to fall and you dropped your keys off the side, you would hit the ground a fraction of a second after your keys did. This means the tens of thousands of tons of reinforced steel and concrete did not put up any resistance at all. There's no way to explain that. Now, the video you're referring to, which you can find if you go to NIST, or you can find it online, they show you what their model did, and it doesn't look like what we saw. And it's
Mhm.
only a few seconds long, and it shows like columns buckling and beams falling in one localized area, and then
Yep.
the building starts to crumple a little bit, and then they don't even show you what happens next.
Yeah.
They just stop it right there, because if they did, people would be like, what are you talking about? This doesn't look anything like the building. It like falls over to one side. They don't tell you this. So, there we have it.
Yeah, you got straight into a single podcast can't encapsulate the
No.
extensive research of this topic. I was going to ask you, what are your personal smoking guns that you would point out? And
Mhm.
that's mine too.
Yeah.
When I
That is the
saw
biggest one. Oh,
biggest
go ahead.
one for
Yeah.
sure, I looked up controlled demolition compilations and I just got a general sense of what they looked like. And I said, okay, there's a pattern here. And then I looked at Building 7, and that one, it's especially knowing NIST, which is the official explanation, and I just got a general sense of what they looked like, and I said, okay, there's a pattern here. And then I looked at Building 7, and that one, it's especially knowing NIST, which is the official explanation, which is a localized fire from the debris of one of the twin towers, caused that. There's a dissonance there that I couldn't relieve at all.
Hmm.
And from that point of uncertainty, that's where you go down and fill in the blanks, implications, and whatnot.
Yes.
Building 7, not to mention its dimensions, it's 140 by 330, feet, and its
No,
footprint.
I mean, it's 400 and some feet wide and
Uh-huh.
500 feet tall, which is a very, very large building. And it housed some very interesting things. It housed offices of the CIA, the Secret Service. It was also the home base of the Emergency Response Center that Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York, was supposed to be using that morning, but he wasn't there. Nobody was there except for a couple of people who survived and actually told a story of explosions going off that morning, not that afternoon. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty here. And by uncertainty, I'm saying there's a lot to back up the idea that this building was blown up for sure. And to be honest with you, to put it into a bigger perspective, if you really, I like going back to things like how does the world work, and
Hmm.
if you examine, for example, what Raw offers to us, and I hope you're okay with me
Go
jumping away,
for it. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
the technical aspect, but Raw, and I really encourage everyone to look at the Law of One, but when he's describing to Don Elkins like how the world works, like what's actually going on over and over again, Bob points out the fact that there are two paths, two polarities, and 90% of advanced civilizations take the positive polarity, and there's a 10% that take the negative polarity, which is a service to self way of looking at the world. And they have perfected that way of looking at things, and they go through the same cycles that we go through. I assume that we're all good here with the service to others path. Um, and they try to influence us, probably all 3D third density civilizations everywhere, and try to recruit them into their way of thinking, right? That's how it works. And in my opinion, Ra gives us a very comprehensive way of like understanding humanity's evolution and history. And I would suggest that what happened that day on September 11th, 2001 to Building 7, negative oriented influence on the planet, however you want to track it back, all the way back to, the Orion social memory complex or the military industrial complex or the other powerful elite societies on the planet, which I do believe exist. They tipped their hand with Building 7. That should be the wake up call for all of us to say, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? And there's a lot of backstory to Building 7, but this was a tell. And we need, before all of us forget or all of us die off in the next 80 years, we have to use this to bring a better understanding to the world about what's really going on. So that's why Building 7 is so important. And if you go and really examine the Twin Towers, you asked me for another smoking gun. Building 7 is a smoking gun. The other smoking gun, requires a little bit of understanding about physics, which is how did the Twin Towers fall? And um, the problem with the explanation, there's a number of with the Twin Towers explanation, is if you believe the mainstream narrative about this, the conventional story is that the top part of the building crushed the bottom part of the building. That's what, if you ask most people, that's what they'll say. There's a couple of things wrong with that. Primarily, there's a law, the third law of motion, Newton's third law says, if you collide with something, you are going to impart the same forces to both things, right? In other words, like for example, if you take two bricks, two things that are made of the same material, and you slam them together, it doesn't matter which one is moving and which one is stationary. If you strike it with enough energy, both bricks will break apart. There's no way around it. That's what has to happen. That's how we These are the laws that determine how we put rockets into space and how, engines work. And if you don't believe me, go try it. Go get two bricks and smash them together and see which one breaks. They're both going to break. So when NIST is telling us that the top part is crushing the bottom, if that's what's happening, then the top part has to get crushed. It has to, because they're made of the same material. And moreover, the bottom part of the building has been constructed more sturdy because it has to support more weight. The girders and columns are built to more exacting standards because they have to support more weight. The bottom has to support way more weight than the top. These are structures that weigh 200,000 tons or more. If you put in all of the equipment and stuff in there, just the structure itself weighs 200,000 tons minimum. Anyway, there's no way for the top to crush the bottom. It's absolutely impossible unless the bottom part was completely unstable to begin with, like decimated. But we see, number one, that if the fires that came from the plane collisions hit the second tower at about floor 80, or the north tower at the 96th floor, all of the structure below it, it looks perfectly intact because it is. And the fires that were burning, the heat goes up. So most of the damage from the planes would have been on the upper floors, not the bottom floors. Moreover, if you look closely at those buildings coming down, you will see that there is no top part crushing the bottom part, especially with the North Tower, the second tower that came down, that had only 14 stories to crush 96 below it. There is no top part. It gets demolished before the bottom part gets demolished. That's like, go and look at it for yourself. So there's a lot of things wrong with the official explanation. But if you actually go and read the document, NC Star 1, the final report on the collapse of the Twin Towers, they tell you specifically, when you look to see, like, how did NIST explain how the third law of motion was violated? Guess what? They tell you explicitly in a small subnote, a footnote, we're not going to tell you how it worked. We're not going to, our analysis, that was outside our scope of analysis, like why it fell, which should shock you, right? Because that's what we think that's what they were trying to explain. And that's what mainstream media says, oh, well, NIST explained it. No, they explicitly say that we're not going to explain it. So they didn't explain how they came up with their hypothesis. They just throw it out there and say, well, look, some initial conditions were met, and we know that was enough because the buildings fell. That is not science. That's not rigorous. That they're just saying, well, look, we know it was the buildings. We know it was the planes because after the planes hit, the buildings fell. So we know it was the planes. That's not an investigation.
Yeah.
I've said a lot there. What do you got?
There's a lot to digest there. A lot of veins I could go on. Yeah, when you mentioned all the metaphysical stuff, I was like, I could go there.
Well, quite honestly, the metaphysical stuff is, I think, far more important.
Yeah, for sure.
And well, as you're thinking, I'm going to introduce this idea as well, because, again, with metaphysics, law of one, over and over again, Ra tells Don, don't, look, we're only answering the call. We're not the ultimate authority on reality. It's an endless pursuit. And as he says in the very first session, your search for who you are is, we guarantee this, it's endless. In fact, science is endless. And, we've just come out of 4 years of people telling us, well, you must trust the science. It's all been, no, every scientific discovery, the scientist that makes this offering is waiting for it to be overturned. It has to be. Science is, by definition, the endless pursuit of defining what is. We're never going to get there. But it's fun to keep going, and we can refine our understanding, because in order to know everything about something, you have to know everything about everything, because it's all connected. And so, what I would like to suggest here is, this is a quandary that our so-called intelligentsia does not really address well, which is, what do you do when experts disagree? This is the question that we were faced with during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And, right? It's like, yeah, they're, all the experts are saying that you need to, do this and do that and take this therapy. There are experts saying that you shouldn't do that. A lot of experts, thousands of experts, my own colleagues, who I've worked with for the last few years have been like screaming at people like, wait a minute, this is wrong. But how do you know who to trust? And if you were truly being objective, whether it's about 9/11 or the monetary system or the COVID pandemic, vaccines, whatever you want to call it, you have to at least acknowledge the fact that there are people out there that know more than you. What do you do when they disagree? You're stuck. There's
Mhm.
no way to make sense of this cognitively, right? We should also, without going into the details of the science, be able to say, holy cow, when I really look at it, both sides are mirror images of each other in the sense that they both believe that they're right. They both believe the other side is incredibly naive or gullible. The other side is spreading misinformation, right? They
Mhm.
look like each other. How do you know which one to trust? You don't, because they know more than you, so you're stuck. But there are very big differences between the two. The first is one side is pleading for a debate. The other side is saying, no, no, we can't have a debate. That's dangerous. That would, people would get the wrong idea. Okay, that doesn't mean that they're wrong. But the question is, if they were wrong, if the side that does not want to debate is wrong, how would they ever know if they don't entertain a dissenting opinion and dismantle it? So you have to be careful, right? I'm not saying that they're wrong, but boy, they could be wrong for a very long time if they're wrong. And secondly, what is the tone that is being used? We're stuck here, right?
Yep.
Because we're saying those guys are experts and we're down here like we don't know epidemiology, vaccine science, immunology. We're not doctors, blah, blah, blah. How do we know? What is the tone being used? If they really are that smart, if one side is that smart, they would have to understand that, oh, I'm speaking to someone who does not have my education or my experience. How do I approach this? For example, how does Ra approach Don Elkins? Does he, take the higher stance and say, well, we're sixth density and you're just third, so you need to listen to us? No, right? That's what, the negative side does. The positive side is like, look, I understand your quandary, your predicament, and you have to use your own. Believe me, you have the ability to make sense of it yourself, and you can believe whatever you want to. But let me explain to you my reasoning, and you can make your own choice. This is a fundamental law of how reality works. And if you were to then suggest to me, no, 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 we can't make up our minds ourselves. We have to trust the higher authority. Do you think that's the way reality works? Because if that's the way it works, then whoever has the loudest microphone, the biggest platform, the most money, the most quote unquote education, they are going to dictate how you live your life. Do you think that's the way reality works? I say, no, it doesn't work that way. I think reality is compassionate. Behind all of it is love. Why would we be living in a reality where whoever is more powerful gets to decide? I say that it's not like that at all. So we have to acknowledge the fact that we as individuals have the power to discern right from wrong, or at least acknowledge where we're uncertain. So, there's a lot of metaphysics tied up into this.
You know what came to my mind when you were describing that dynamic?
Ice cream?
Maybe after this.
Yeah.
But
Now tell me, what came to mind?
so yeah, you mentioned both sides mirror each other, whether you're the COVID vaccine advocate or the anti-vaxxer advocate, or the truther versus the debunker in 9/11. Uh, Name other any conspiracy theory where there's two halves of the coin. You said they all believe that the other person is lying, that they are right, etc. But yeah, to sum up what you said, the differences were the negative is centralized in structure. The positive is not, it's decentralized.
Yep.
And that's a key difference,
Oh my
actually.
God.
And that from that point, it determines a lot of incentives and therefore human behavior and therefore what we see in the pandemic and conspiracies and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I guess, that's where my train of thought went back then. What's like the metaphysical tie to determining the truth here? And I just have to shed light on this connotation of conspiracy in general. There's a forbidden ooze to it. And when I look at conspiracy and I understand that human incentive dictates all behavior, which is basically saying the negative polarity acts one way. They're incentivized to act that way. They must polarize. In order to polarize, they must act that way, and vice versa. Some things that are deemed very conspiratorial, that's a stretch, dude. You're wearing a tinfoil hat. They just make more sense. Let's take COVID, for example. Anthony Fauci and the circle of virologists in the back end were exchanging emails saying, hey, this virus looks very manufactured. We're uncertain. They were uncertain behind the scenes.
Yeah.
They were 50-50. And for one of the last emails, 3 days later, they released the paper Proximal Orders of COVID-19 with absolute certainty that this was not lab engineered. This was natural origin. The only reason we know that is because of FOIA requests. So this would have been in the dark if not because of that. They had this incentive to preserve their reputation, thus conceal. And in the forefront, in the facade, they put out absolute certainty, authority, centralization, trust us, trust the science. Shout out Anthony Fauci. I am science, he says. um,
Mm-hmm.
and then to put it off, they really push the vaccine, which has money ties, patents, all that stuff. There's just incentive there that I just see a natural tie. Like there's incentives here to promote this and conceal that. And in that umbrella, conspiracy becomes just a natural conclusion. Nothing conspiracy literally means to conceal, a group that conceals in order to gain basically from people.
Yeah.
But there's this connotation that's you're Alex Jones or something.
No, no, we're being demonized. Boy, you brought up, first of all, I am so glad that you're aware of all of the stuff behind COVID. And you were talking about the Proximal Origins paper written by Christian Anderson from the Scripps Institute and a number of co-authors who are very, very respected virologists and epidemiologists. And to be honest with you, last year when they were being cross-examined by the House subcommittee, and this came up, it was the emails, right? Like they all were like, boy, I don't know what to make of this. And then boom, they switched their thing. And then they all, it was Christian Anderson and Robert Gary that were defending the paper. And of course, they said, no, Fauci did not influence us. And it was just not Fauci. It was also Jamie Farrar, who is now the chief scientist at the WHO, but he used to be the chair of the Wellcome Trust, a multi-billion-dollar foundation out of England. So extremely powerful guys. And they both said, no, we didn't try to influence Anderson and Gary and that whole thing. And so, unfortunately, the thread was lost because the real evidence that there's something screwy going on, they all are claiming, they're all denying it. The real point there was that if you look at the paper itself, the Proximal Origins paper, which is printed in Nature Medicine in March of 2020, their basic argument, they have a computer model that tries to figure out what is the optimal solution. In other words, what is the proper conformation of the spike protein, which is a protein on the SARS-CoV-2 virus, for matching the ACE2 receptor of our cells, right? And they're saying that, well, our computer model shows that the best solution is not from the virus. The virus has a suboptimal solution. It works, obviously, because it spreads, but there's a better way to do it. And therefore, it could not have come from a lab. Now, there's something very wrong with that argument. It's a stupid argument, to be honest with you, because you can make in a lab you don't know what, there are many different ways of engineering the viruses. You don't have to, come up with a sequence of amino acids and proteins, that will give you the protein that you want. You can just put it into a petri dish and repetitively look for the features you want, and then you don't know what's going to come out of it. It's like nature on steroids. You find out what you want, and then you end up with a solution. It doesn't have to be the computer solution, and these guys know that. But moreover, if it was created in a lab, these then are basically bioterrorists who made that. I'm saying if it was created, why would they choose the best optimal solution that all computers would tell you is the best solution? That would be the fingerprints of human engineering. These people are not trying to show that that was made by a human. They would be trying to hide the fact that it was made by a human. And this is the kind of argument that, was never used against Christian Anderson and Robert Gary. It's like, that's a stupid explanation. Like, why would someone of your caliber make that argument? You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So that's, sadly being lost on the public. You mentioned decentralization
Mhm.
in terms of sense making. Notice that there's another extremely important manifestation of decentralization that's occurring right now, and that has to do with transactions. This has to
Mhm.
do with blockchain technology, right? We are trying to decentralize the validation of an exchange of value using blockchain technology. In other words, we're trying to eliminate the arbiter of truth. The same thing that's happening right now with, like, how do we make sense of things? Oh, you need to, trust a centralized authority. No, you have to trust yourself. And how do we, eliminate the central banking and the centralization of monetary transactions? You have to use something like blockchain and make sure that the environment, the entire milieu, comes up with the answer. So I think, we are truly seeing a movement towards what has to happen in going into 4D. It's happening in many different ways right now. And so I'm glad you brought that up. You mentioned something else, but I can't remember what it was, but I wanted to comment on it. But go ahead.
Mm. Yeah, podcasts like this, another example of decentralizing knowledge,
Mm-hmm. Well, yes.
there's
Oh, very good.
very there's millions. Well, I saw there's a log actually on how many podcasts there are. It's over 4 million. And
Mm-hmm.
that's wonderful news. There's obviously ups and downs between all of them, but
Yeah.
it's better than mainstream media's, I don't know, a couple hundred, right?
Yep. That's right. And sadly, there's something else going on there in the alternative news sphere, is that there's only a handful of podcasts that generate the most number of views, you
Yeah.
know, and they're now becoming the authorities
Yep.
on the alternative sphere. And you've probably witnessed this yourself, is that you have like big voices like Joe Rogan and Candace Owens, or Tucker Carlson, who are deemed unworthy of proper audiences, but they're generating a lot of views. But they tend to bring on the same people over and over again, and they're not bringing on the right experts, sadly. um, you
Yeah,
know
right? I
Like,
can
yeah, Tucker Carlson will bring on Russell Brand. It's like, great, or Candace Owens will bring on, whoever. It's like, yeah, but you guys are just a bunch of journalists. You're like podcast people. No offense there, Kenford, but
yeah.
like you're not a scientist. And to someone like Joe Rogan, who's brought on some real scientists like oh my gosh, Robert Malone and Peter McCullough, and people in that sphere, good for them. But there's so many other independent scientists out there that have something to say, but we don't have access to those kind of platforms. But it's going to happen. But in any case, you have to rely on your own wits. That's what we're being called to do right now. And I also, I don't know when you want to end this. I can keep going for a very long time, believe me. But I don't want this to be lost, which is, as we look at the malevolence that's out there, when you really start to look at and see what's going on, I don't want to lose our humanity in this, and realize and just think that, oh my gosh, there's nothing but psychopaths out there and they've done horrible things. They need to be held accountable. Yeah, I believe in accountability, but let's also remember that they are giving us catalyst. Without
Mhm.
them, we would be stuck just sort of like, hanging out, not making any spiritual progress. You need to have this adversity out there. And they're serving a very, very important role, probably unknowingly. But as we sit there and, incriminate them, uh, we also have to acknowledge that they're playing a role. And this is very, very difficult to see for most people, because we tend to look at our lives as having a start and end, and then an end to our existence. And the reality is that we're like, this is a playground. We're just trying to get out of the playground and, maybe move on out of third density. And we need these people. We need this catalyst. So I'm not denying the suffering that's being caused, but also we have to understand that this is a temporary situation. And this is again where we have to bring in the metaphysics of what's happening. If you believe that when you die, you're done, then of course you're going to play into this. Like, yeah, why not? I want a bigger piece of the pie. If time is limited, I'm probably going to work to manipulate people around me so I get more. If this is my,
Hmm.
my only chance. But if you're able to step back from it and say, okay, well, this is just a chapter in an infinite book, number one. And I would like to save the planet. I would like to save humanity, but I don't think they're endangered, to be honest with you. You know, we get caught up in this. We have to fix things. No, everything is going to move on as just as it should. This is going to be, like clockwork, as Ross says. We're moving on. The planet is moving on, and we don't have to save humanity. We have to just work on ourselves, and whatever happens, happens, because we're all going to be moving on. 40 negative, 40 positive, another 3D cycle, another 75,000 years. And, I don't mean to sort of drop law of one stuff on you left and right, but that to me, I think is a body of knowledge that really needs to be dissected and considered as we go through this particular time in the Earth's evolution and our own species.
Would love to have a dedicated Law of One episode with you.
Oh God,
That would be awesome just to, because there's many implications with that. Because you're basically trusting a channel text, and people would be saying, "Oh, why would you do that? You don't even know it's channeled. How do
yeah,
you know this woman didn't just fabricate it? The trio didn't fabricate it." There's just
yeah,
all these implications. You believe things can be channeled, but that's a whole nother episode.
that is a whole
Uh,
other visit. But to tie it all back together to the book, I only have one foreword in my book, and it's written by Jim McCarty, and it's just like a very short paragraph in the beginning of the book. And to his credit, he didn't know me from anybody, but he was willing to read my manuscript, and he did, and he wrote that. And the book really is about the reason why I'm bringing this up is I'm not sure if we covered this before we got cut off. That's why I'm bringing it up again. But the book is about introducing the world to the law of one through 9/11 and through all these other
yeah,
things. Because the world is not ready to just, like you said, why should I believe channeling? Why should I believe the trio? Well, you must first avail yourself of what's being channeled before you make a judgment. And unlike all the other spiritual texts that we refer to, whether that be the Bible or the Quran or whatever, I'm not going to say too much about the Quran because I don't know. But how do we know how many times it has been either modified or corrupted? Let's just stay with the Bible, for example. I mean, we're looking at a version that was written 400 years after Jesus walked the planet. How do we know what's been left out, what's been omitted, what's been um, tweaked? But you can go and listen to the exact words, if you want to, of Carla Ruckart, syllable by syllable, reciting what has been transcribed. So it may have come from a weird source, or maybe they made it up, but there's not going to be any distortion. It's one pass.
hmm,
Um, and if you actually read the law of one, it is hard to imagine that this was concocted by three people. Just the beauty of the responses are just so mind blowing, which is why I use it as a centerpiece for how I make sense of everything.
yeah. If I had to loosely give myself a religious affiliation, I would be a Law of One follower. I don't know how to phrase that, but that'd be my religion,
Mm-hmm.
loosely said. So 9/11 is just not about 9/11. There's more to it than that. The
That's right.
implications are far reaching, beyond your comprehension. Not even on world events. There's implications of who blew up the towers then, if that were true. Second order consequences on the victims, the perpetrators, etc. But this is just a side story of how I came to be in this place. I came from this place from a disjointed family, and I was seeking. I got into health, got into the nutrition rabbit hole. And then to tie this back into 9/11, I found out something nefarious was going on with the food industry, big pharma. This was, there was incentives to keep patients as patients, not to cure them truly. And from that point on, I was there for myself, just to be well, enhance myself, all that stuff. But then once I found out about that nefarious element, then I said, as a progression, you guys are evil. The victims were all in this together. And there was some sense of orientation for others introduced into who I was for the first time ever. I remember one day, my older brother, I was very young. We were at McDonald's. This is to give you contrast. The waitress brought us the fries, right? And
Mm,
my brother thanked her. And my 11-year-old self was like, "Why are you thanking her? That's her job."
mm,
And he looked at me stunned, like, "Dude, she didn't have to bring the fries over to us. You know that, right?"
mm,
And from that point on, I was kind of humbled, like, "Oh man, that was a spoiled remark to make. Like, don't thank these people. That's their job. It's transactional kind of thing.
yeah,
Self-centered, spoiled. That's how I was raised."
mhm,
So in the health awakening, I discovered big pharma, and then I sought to learn to eventually become a doctor. For various reasons, I'm not on that path anymore. But for 9/11, if you find out the truth about these events, you'll see that there's perpetrators and victims, and that has implications for your love of humanity, your care for humanity. That's already there if you're on the other side, on the debunkers. But you will go down a rabbit hole and form a trajectory that will change your life, that will inevitably lead you to spirituality, because that's the end game in this endless game. But yeah, that's what I wanted to touch on. We didn't just come here to discuss 9/11 to, hey, we're right. There's just more things to it. The fruits are endless. It's an endless vine of fruits, and you just have to see for yourself. You
mhm,
can't you can't watch a 2-hour podcast and digest all the implications, multi-layered implications. It's a seed that's planted and rooted, and it spreads like a wildfire. So
mm.
that was that was my bit.
Yeah, well said, Kenford. I do believe that it's important to understand that we're not trying to put forth a dystopian view of the world. In
Mm,
fact, when you unpack this, you will see that we have the potential of liberating our species from war. And it doesn't take much research to go back and just look at the big events that led us to huge conflict, where we have immense amount of knowledge that demonstrate that this is, at the time we misconceived what was happening. You can go back to World War One, the war to end all wars, if you will. And the reason why this country was brought into World War One was the sinking of the Lusitania. And it's clear that that was let happen on purpose. The boat was, I'm not going to go into all the details, but we did not protect the British Navy didn't protect the Lusitania in waters that were known to be lurking with U-boats, and the boat sank, and 1,000 Americans died, and suddenly, 2 years later, we're in World War One. There's a lot of questions about what happened at Pearl Harbor. I'm not saying that it didn't happen; it happened, but was there foreknowledge of this happening? Look into that. I mean, we were brought into Vietnam based on an event that happened in the South China Sea called the Gulf of Tonkin event, um, and that was our own ship, the USS Maddox. We're told was attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. That didn't happen. Our own Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara, has stated publicly that no, that actually didn't happen. These are all called false flag events, right? This is the manufactured event to mobilize public opinion in support of conflict. And this is how most conflict, I think, actually happens on the planet. This is the sort of, fifth density manipulation of those of us who want love and peace are being brought into conflict over
yeah.
and over and over again, right? If just like, look, we have the ability to imagine. We don't have to know the facts. What if you were a king in England, or medieval Europe or something like that, and you had a large, fiefdom, and you wanted more money, and you wanted an army, and you wanted more power, and you went around to all of the serfs and said, everybody, you got to cough up your, piece of gold to support the army. And then everybody's like looking at you with starving eyes, and you point out that your kids over there that are all covered in dust, and you're poor, and you're like, we don't have any money. Okay, you don't want to pay? Fine. 2 weeks later, what happens? Suddenly, your town has been burned to the ground by people dressed up in the garb of the enemies. And then the king's army comes by again and says, well, do you want to pay up now? Yeah, you start paying up money. It's like, yeah, please, I want your protection. How How long would it take for the king to understand that, oh, that's a great way to get them to pay up? You just, disguise your own people in the garb of the enemy, burn down the town, and then you have your army. This is called a false flag event. This is way easier
Mhm.
than begging people to hand over your taxes. You make them pay and you extort it out of them. This is happening all the time. And 9/11 is, I think, the best example of how this works, because you don't have to be an expert to see that what we were told was wrong.
It's right in front of your eyes, and that's the most asinine form of gaslighting could ever formulate. Don't
Yep.
believe what you see with your own eyes. And I'm not an engineer, but no way a fire could spread so wide to where all steel beams melt simultaneously at once into a
Correct.
symmetrical free fall in 2.25 seconds. That's just, I have to
Yep.
thank NIST for that because they
Right.
gave me a contrast in their official explanation
Mhm.
to see how asinine that is.
Yep. Well, just to be clear, before we move on, it was about 7 seconds, not 2.25. We want to make,
Okay.
make sure that we're spreading the right numbers. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's impossible. And you have to also ask yourself why it like look at the Twin Towers. Why did all of these fire companies send their courageous firemen and firewomen into the Twin Towers while it was burning? These are very, very brave people, but they don't go into structures that are unstable. None of them.
Yeah.
The reason why there was so many casualties is because they didn't expect the buildings to collapse, because it's never happened before. We're talking about steel. There's never been a fire-induced steel structure collapse in the history of architecture, before or after. Only on that day did that happen. And what are we supposed to do now? Like, whenever there's a fire in a steel structure, we just expect it to collapse? No, we don't do that. We know it's not going to collapse, but we're being expected to drop reality and accept this other narrative, like you said, an asinine narrative, really, just for that one day. Abandon the laws of motion, abandon what we know about steel structures, abandon all logic. Otherwise, we're a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah. It's pretty smart.
Mm-hmm.
I gotta give it to him.
Yep.
You gotta
Well,
to masquerade the truth, you gotta use a lot of clever tactics and social dynamics,
oh yeah.
and you can kind of pull it off, but it's hard to conceal light. That
Well, we're being asked to, we got to step up and not only talk about the science, but just accept the fact that people are going to disagree with us about it.
Mhm.
And right now in this country, at least, perhaps something even more is under assault, which is, if we have any hope of breaking free of control, we cannot sacrifice the First Amendment. I don't care what
Yeah.
you believe. Like, if you believe that we're all idiots here, Kenford and myself, that's fine, and you have every right to write malicious things about us.
Hmm.
I will support your right to do that, but let us not take away the right to say terrible things. That's why the First Amendment was written, not about spreading, love. It was about protecting people that you disagreed with, and we have to be able to step up to that. Again, here's another clever tactic. I know we're closing down here, but these are very interesting conversations for me.
Hmm.
Um, which is, we talk about, like, oh, we have the right to say anything we want to, except hate speech. You can't talk about hate speech. You cannot talk about misinformation. You cannot talk about fires in a theater. Hold on a second now. Wait a minute. We have to understand something. Like, who determines what's hate speech? Who determines what misinformation is? So I really believe that we think we have an understanding of what the First Amendment is, but the people who created this experiment in democracy and self-governance did not put the burden upon the purveyors of information, the people who create the information, to say the truth. They put the responsibility on the populace to be able to make sense of what's right and wrong. That's the only way this works. So if you think that we are incapable to know what's right from what's wrong, then we don't deserve the First Amendment. It's gone. It's our responsibility to have a discussion and talk through things. If we abandon this, then we have abandoned, I would say, self-governance. We've abandoned democracy. And for all intents and purposes, the pendulum is swinging back towards 40 negative. It's like, oh, we're losing it now, people. We're losing our control over our own agency if we start to say, oh yeah, well, we can throw away the First Amendment. I would advise all of you out there right now to go to the Department of Homeland Security and look at what has been codified in terms of laws. Right now, dis, mis, and malinformation, everybody needs to know what those things are. Don't take my word for it. Go and look at what it means. There's a specific definition. Note that under the last administration, I'm not going to name any names, but in the last 4 years, those things now are considered domestic terrorism. This should be scaring us. It's happening behind the scenes. No one's talking about it. I'm not saying, who to vote for, but I'm saying, look at what's happening right now. They are telling us what uh, can be considered domestic terrorism, and it's very, very scary because domestic terrorism and terrorism are being equated. So we have to be careful. We're falling down a slippery slope, and I wouldn't be surprised if we've gotten a lot further down than we realize. We may have jumped off a cliff here, but these kinds of conversations are extremely important.
I didn't know there was now legal definitions of misinformation.
Yes, well, look, this is how they're defining it. Disinformation is stuff that somebody tells you is factually incorrect, that is being intentionally spread with the intent of, being uncomfortable for the government, pretty much for authorities,
For the
or
government. Okay.
quote
There's the
unquote your
key.
safety, your safety. I mean, they're going to say your safety, but it goes both ways.
Mm,
Misinformation is stuff that is incorrect as deemed by some third party, which is not intentionally spread. You're
okay.
just sort of saying it, but you don't understand. And then we have something called malinformation. These are true facts that are not given the right, put in the right context, and is misleading. This also is in the same category as dismiss information. So we're at a sense-making crisis, and we're being told that we can't make sense of it ourselves. It has to be coming down from the Department of Homeland Security, which incidentally was formed after 9/11. There was no Department of Homeland Security when I was growing up. So all of these things have been put into place. So we have to be very, very careful about what's happening, and we have to approach this with the sincerity to do the right thing and to still love each other.
That's very Orwellian.
Yeah,
I never I, I read that book in high school and I never thought I'd see a day where a Ministry of Truth like
yeah,
similar body is being formed. Because the key question is who is the arbiter of what is misinformation and etc. And
yes,
yeah, that's disturbing, but it's not cause for cynicism. It's cause for it's catalyst for us
yes,
to hone our wisdom and intuition.
yep.
So yeah, well said. Um, and just for a side note, for anyone who disagrees, I just wanted to touch on that as well. You are equally important because you are a part of the equation. Because truth, we get to the truth through discourse and not groupthink.
Mhm.
So disagreement is not bad. We're both seeking the same thing. This
Yes,
was thrown out during COVID. This was any dissent was demonized. And that was my red flag. Personally, that was my red pill. Um, why? You're a part of the truth and the pursuit of truth, and that's great. Yeah, you are entitled to your positions, and it's okay for disagreement. We're all here for it, but we're all seeking the same thing, which is the truth of behind of what happened that day. But yeah, I don't know if you know this, Madhava. I'm a military enlisted lab tech for the Air Force.
thank you.
Um, yeah, yeah, of course. And that puts me in touch with the middle class, their lives, the collective consciousness, you could say, a fragment, fractal of the collective consciousness. And inflation's really bad. The hours are long, technology's everywhere, social media, etc. Lots of distractors. Work takes up 40 hours a week. We have families to get to. There's all these things that pull us away and that don't necessarily give us rise or give us the capacity to comprehend anything we're discussing here. There's
Mhm.
just no room. You were so oriented with our survival first, our
Yeah,
like unsettled unsatisfied inner feelings first that you have no choice but to project onto people who are seemingly crazy. And there's no time, no interest, no capacity to dive into 9/11 and all these things. And
Mhm.
so I don't hold I don't hold resentment for anybody like that. I see it firsthand, and that's okay. I get where they're coming from, but you must eventually come to see these things because there's a deeper truth to reality than you are presented with by mainstream media and consensus population. So,
Mhm.
any any parting words before we sign off?
Mm, well, I would like to first thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast. These are the kind
Pleasure's
of,
mine.
yeah, well, thank you. These are the kind of conversations that are so vital right now. And it doesn't matter, honestly, if you get a dozen views or a dozen million views. As Ross says, just helping one person is enough. And sometimes it's I can't quote Ra right now, but he says something or they say something very interesting, which is like it's inherently futile, to teach anybody anything, but we're going to keep trying. And the the response here, I hope people will write comments, and I will try and I'll watch your the YouTube or wherever you publish this, and I will try to respond to things. You can come to my channel. I have a Substack called An Insult to Intuition. And the idea here is you can disagree, but please let's all support our right to express ourselves because we cannot lose that. And there's one more thing which had to do with, oh yes, yes, I know I talk a lot. We all, as you said, Kenford, there's no time for these kinds of discussions and contemplation. And if you were to, this is another reason why the law of one is such a gem, because there is a desire from the negative path to push us back down to the red ray, to not let the self-emergent desire for growth through our energy system to start crystallizing different chakras. It's very easy to keep someone stuck in the red ray. You just threaten their life. We're back down to survival. Forget about like, oh, let's talk, let's
Mhm.
contemplate what happens in the fifth density. How are we going to balance it? There's no time for that. There's no time for that if you're stuck. And there are many ways to do that. One is war. Another way, as you said, is to keep people busy. I really suggest that people take a very strong look at how the central banking system works. This is one of the
Yep.
chapters in the book. This is basically to keep us working. Ask yourself, you're a very young man, and I wish you a long future, a long, healthy future. But when I was your age, or younger, you didn't need to have a graduate education in order to buy a house. Um, Plenty of time. You had a pension. You could, work and a reasonable work week and support a family. You didn't have this crushing debt. There's a reason why things are expensive. It's because money is being made available to you so easily. If there's more money being made available, things are going to get more expensive and people are going to get crushed, especially if you don't increase the minimum wage. This is another way to making people poor. So, anyway, speaking metaphysically, there's a reason why these things are happening. It's so that you and I cannot have a conversation in front of an audience that's truly curious because we're too busy.
Mhm.
So that's it. And yes, thank you for allowing me to showcase my ideas, my Substack, and I hope people will check out the book. It's
Of course, and I hope an update comes soon to that book. I'd love a part two.
I'm too busy,
Or
man. I'm too busy.
yeah, full-time anesthesiologist.
Got to
Yeah,
make the money.
understandable. Of
No,
course,
no, I love writing. Anyway, I've moved most of my thoughts to my Substack. I hope people will check it out.
I will
And
check it out.
yeah, and by the way, it's going to ask you, do you want to subscribe for a paying subscription? You don't have to pay. Everybody can leave comments. I want an open discussion. I don't need the money. So please subscribe and check out what's there. There's many, I think, more informative discussions about 9/11 there, and especially my own experience coming out as a conspiracy theorist, for example, to my fellow MIT grads at reunion and see what they had to say and how I dealt with that. So these are the kinds of conversations I'd like to have. And thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it was an honor, and I look forward to having you on again on other umbrellas that such as the Law of One. We gotta do a Law of One episode.
Totally.
And yeah, I appreciate your time. And I hope the audience took anything away. If you took one thing away. I'll end on this note. If you're influenced positively in any way, such as you're more positively oriented towards others in the slightest way, where your trajectory is just up to the service to others, if it's just one person, you potentially, there is no way you can quantify that in terms of value.
Right.
What dollars? How many dollars to become a better person and help people? There's no way you can quantify that. So when Madhava quoted Ra that one person is enough, serving the one is serving the infinite creator, that there's literally logical connections to that because you can't quantify value of helping someone and improving their life. It's priceless. So
Mm.
by that pricelessness, one person is more than enough. And yeah, I hope it reaches your heart. So thank you, Madhava, for coming on. And this time we'll be signing off. So I'll see you guys back next time on the Guiding Lighthouse podcast. Cheers, everybody.
Bye.
Thank, thank you, Madhava.